Barbara.
Hello. So thank you all for joining us. I'm Barbara Fortner, the president of the Narber Civic Association. The co-host for tonight is Andy Mosner. Andy, do you want to wave? He's a board member of the Civic. Just to let you know, this meeting is being live streamed on YouTube, and it's being recorded so that we can make it available for folks to view later. So this town hall is being hosted by the Civic Association because the Narberth Planning Commission and the Lower Merion Planning Commission asked us to facilitate community input on the pedestrian, bike, and vehicle issues at the proposed development at 3 Elmwood Avenue. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to start the evening with a 10-minute chat from Todd Bressey, who is the chair of the Narberth Planning Commission, a 10-minute overview of the process. Then that's going to be followed by a 20 to 30-minute presentation from the developers team. And then we'll open the floor for your questions and comments. As I said, this town hall has a very focused topic. So if you have questions or comments about other aspects of this development or development in particular, or in general, those are things that you should consider taking to a planning commission meeting, a council meeting, sending an email to the borough council members, some other forum. So we're going to ask you to use the chat function to indicate that you want to speak. So you can put something in there as simple as, I want to speak. Or you can put in there your question or your comment, and either Andy or I will read it. We're going to go through the chat in order. So first in, first out, kind of like if you were standing in a line at a microphone in Borough Hall in the big room. We ask that you remain muted when you're not speaking. So wait until you've been called upon and then unmute and speak. And, you know, as we see how many people join us, we'll think about, can we give you 3 minutes to speak, or does it look like there's so many people who want to speak? We'll give you 2 minutes, because we'd like this to, if at all possible, be over in 90 minutes or thereabouts, you know, that kind of length of meeting. So we'll keep that in mind. We'll let you know. Andy will be timing you, and he'll let you know when you're getting near the end of your time or when you've gotten to the end of your time. And to allow everyone a chance to speak, if what you're wanting to say is basically the same thing that someone else has said, please consider saying, I agree with so-and-so, as a way to just allow more time for other folks to speak. So there's nothing else that I need to say at this point, I'll turn it over to Todd Bressey.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. And thanks to the Civic Association for hosting this conversation. We appreciate that in so many ways you create kind of an opportunity for dialogue in our community. And this is an important project, an important issue. And so we're glad you're here to lend a hand. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Mr. Falcone and his team for making themselves available for this conversation. We know you're being pulled in a lot of directions to, you know, make this, get your application together and cover the bases you need to. And so we're very grateful that you are spending the time to talk with us about these issues that the community cares about. I thought it would be useful. Oh, I'd also like to acknowledge 2 other people who are here. Mike Schneider from Pannoni Associates is the Borough of Narberth's traffic engineer. The borough is able to call him in situations like this to evaluate traffic issues related to new developments or other projects the borough is working on. And Chris Leswing, who is the Director of Building and Planning for Lower Merion Township, and as many of you know, is a leading force in planning bicycle networks along the main and Lower Merion and along the main line. And I'm very glad that Chris agreed to join because he may be able to answer questions about planning for bicycle connectivity in this area of Narberth and Lower Merion Township. So thank you both. Thank you both for being here. I wanted to, for the community members who are here in attendance, I wanted to take a minute just to draw a general picture of where we are in the process of reviewing this development approval, just so you have a little bit of a context for this conversation tonight. And I'll speak somewhat in generalities, but in general, a land development and subdivision proposal like this goes through three stages of review, which are called tentative sketch plan, the preliminary plan, and the final plan. At each of those steps, the project is reviewed by the borough's or a municipality's planning team, in this case, the borough's consultants, a zoning officer, an engineer and a traffic engineer, by the planning commission, and by the elected body, in this case, the borough council. Now, this is an unusual development because it spans two municipalities, Lower Merion Township and Narberth. So each municipality is independently, but cooperatively and collaboratively reviewing this project. That means to say, each of us has our own professional teams that are looking at these applications and in the context of our own codes and requirements. But I and our team are working very closely with Chris Lesswing and his team to sort out, many issues that arise when you have to look at a project that's in two municipalities, just related to building and development. So, and I always pause to thank Chris and his team for their help with this. This is a project that takes a lot of resources to review, and we are very grateful, and we benefit very much from Lower Merion's work on this and their collaboration with us. So thanks, Chris, and Jillian and the rest of everyone there who's working with us. So there are three steps: the tentative sketch plan review, the preliminary plan review, and the final plan review. This project has already received this tentative sketch plan review. That was the series of meetings that we had late last year and early last year. And as you remember, the project went through 3 or 4 major iterations before it was finally approved. The tentative sketch review is essentially a review to find out whether or not a development can be undertaken within the context or within the confines of the zoning code, essentially. Does it meet the zoning code? What kinds of relief are needed from the zoning code or from the subdivision and land development code? Those are the 2 main codes we look at. It's a process that's pretty much mandated by state law. We don't have a whole lot of flexibility in how we do it. It's, the state kind of sets up the guidelines for this. And there's some pluses and minuses to this process, but that's what happens at the first stage. Is the development consistent with the borough and the township's zoning and subdivision and land development codes? And after a few iterations and back and forth and very useful and helpful input from the community, the applicant arrived at the proposal that was ultimately recommended for approval by both Lower Merion Township and Narberth as being consistent with its code. Now that approval came with a very long letter with a lot of conditions. We'll approve it if you do this, which are mostly conditions right now about how the applicant goes about working on the next phase of its application, the preliminary review. And that's actually why we're here tonight, because one of the conditions of approval was that the applicant meet with the community in a town hall type setting, in addition to the required planning commission and council meetings, so the community would have a more opportunity to ask for information, raise questions, and make comments about the project. So that's why we're here today. The applicant recently, I guess it was Friday, submitted the paperwork for the preliminary plan review. As of now, I'm not aware that the first step when that paperwork is submitted is that the borough staff and the township staff review the paperwork to make sure that it's complete, that the application includes everything it's got to include, and all the parts are there so that it can actually, go into a formal review. When it's decided that the application is complete, the application will be given to the zoning officer, the borough engineer, to the planning commission. I neglected to mention earlier, the Montgomery County Planning Commission also provides an advisory review. So the Montgomery County Planning Commission will receive that. And then there's a clock, a 60-day clock, 60, 90, there's a clock of a certain amount of time by which the application has to be reviewed and acted upon. So we're about to enter that next phase of review of that project. And so you'll begin to see that coming up on the agenda of our commissions pretty soon. The preliminary review is probably the most thorough and exhaustive step of review. That's where a lot of the things that everyone here cares about are really looked at closely. The tentative sketch review is cursory, and it's often frustrating to people because it's really just focused on the zoning compliance. This is the review where issues like traffic, which is vehicles, pedestrians, bicycles, which we're going to be talking about tonight. That's where that is looked at. Stormwater management is looked at. The design of the buildings is looked at. The grading, the landscaping, trees, all these issues are looked at this phase of development. When it goes through the same process, like I described before, there are staff reviews, then the planning commission makes a recommendation, and then the council and the board of commissioners have to determine whether or not they would approve that preliminary plan. And they may well request that the applicant accept other conditions as well, based on the nature of the application and what kind of comments come up in the review. When that phase is complete, the final phase then is called the final review. The applicant then resolves all outstanding issues raised by the staff, the planning commission, the borough council, and brings back a final application that is supposed to include all the modifications that address the issues that were raised and which were agreed to needed to be resolved. So the final plan review is really just a checkoff, really. Did the applicant really take care of the things that they were asked to take care of? And it goes through that same process, the staff review, planning commission, and the borough council and the lower Marion commissioners would review it at that stage as well. Each of these steps takes several months. So we're beginning the second step, and after that, there will be a bit of time when the applicant completes their work and then comes back for the final step. So in short, this is really the stage at which the issues that people have been raising since this development has begun, since discussion about this development has begun, this is the step at which these issues are really talked about in depth. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you both again. And Barbara, if you want to entertain any questions just about the process itself, like how things move through, I'd be happy to answer them now or whenever. I'll be around for the rest of the meeting, so whenever you'd like to put them on the table. And I don't know, Chris, since you are in charge of Lower Marion's review, would you like to add anything for the public's benefit to know?
Well, Todd, I thought you did a really good summary of that. And I think with our review, this is super helpful. I really want to thank the Narva Civic Association for putting this on tonight. Our process is we listen and we try to engage in some complex problem solving. So I'm really here tonight, not as much to talk, but to really listen, to try to find out, is there needs for things, how to make some connections, how to establish some partnerships along the way. To help make this better. I will just note a little bit of frustration that there's only so much one developer can do. And one of the things that we need to do as a community is start to work together to plan this corridor. We can't do it lot by lot. I mean, there's only so much developer can do by his site. And for years, Lower Merion and Narberth haven't really worked together. We're next to each other. We all see each other in a supermarket, but we don't work together. I think having meetings like this and having the relationship that we've established primarily through Todd's leadership with Narberth has really opened up everybody to those conversations. So we can start to plan for those bigger improvements that are needed for bike and pedestrian connections. Like I say, it's not all just this one property. It's really looking at that whole Wynwood Avenue corridor. So it's a start, a good start.
Thanks, Chris. Over to you, Barbara.
Okay, I think I'm going to suggest that if people do have questions about the process, that we wait until the question and answer period, just so there's enough time to get through everything. So I want to turn it over to Vince Falcone, who's the developer of the project. And Vince, for some reason, your camera is still not cooperating for you. So we don't see you, but I know you're still there. So go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened to the camera, but first of all, thank you for having us. And I know we're here to talk about traffic related issues. So I brought with me the traffic portion of the team. Chris John is here, who will give a quick overview of the project. He's kind of the team leader of the project. So he will, give a quick explanation of that. And then I brought Frank Tavani, who did the traffic study, and he'll get into his traffic study and be here to answer any questions. And I also have Bernd Panzak, who handled the pedestrian and bike studies. So, with that, I'll turn it over to Chris John and let him give an overview.
Thanks, Vince. Thanks, Barbara, Todd, and Chris. So my name's Chris John. I'm the civil engineer for the project. I'll just do a brief overview here to show you the site. I'm going to trace it here with my screen. Right now, this site goes all the way from Elmwood Avenue to the railroad tracks over to East Wynwood Road. There's an existing home 3 Elmwood, which faces Elmwood Avenue. There is a channelized stream that cuts through the site. And really this western side of the site is where the development will take place. These are the 3 new buildings, each have 2 units. In the different municipalities, they have different names, either a 2-family dwelling. Here, we'll just call them twins. I think that's typically what people are familiar with. We do have 1 ingress driveway into a parking area and 1 egress driveway coming out. I can also quickly draw the line here that cuts through the site that separates between Narberth and Lower Merion Township. We believe this was created back when East Wynwood Road had a harder curve, and when they increased the radius to that curve, that's when it created some Lower Merion property on the Narberth side of East Wynwood Road. This is really an interesting property in Narberth, given that it's on the south side, separated by the railroad tracks, but it's the only property west of this stream, the channelized stream. So it's really in an interesting spot here. So that's just the real quick overview. There's the only existing improvements on this side of the stream right now are an existing sidewalk that's about 4 to 4.5 feet wide, just right next to the curb. One of the proposals is to widen the sidewalk to 5 feet and to provide a 2-foot grass strip called a verge. And with that, I will pass it on to Frank Tavani, the traffic engineer, and I will stop my screen share, but if anyone needs me to do that, please let me know.
Thank you, Chris. I think at this time, Byrne was going to give me a hand with putting up the traffic study that was submitted last week. I don't know if the screen share could get passed over to Mr. Panzak. Fantastic. So I'm going to go through the whole traffic study, not all the appendices, but about 15 slides. It's going to sort of be a hodgepodge of text and some of the appendices. As you can see on page 1, the report is dated April 22nd. And as you just saw in the site plan, what we are talking about is 6 residential units. And I'm happy to hear Chris Leswing's comments as always, but in particular tonight, his comment that we have to keep in mind scale. This is a relatively small development, and that's something that the perspective for that should not be lost. Next slide, please. Okay, so page 2, here's where I start talking about some of the existing conditions and some of the traffic count conditions. I took some liberties here to highlight some things I wanted to be sure to talk about in my allotted time. The traffic counts, the base traffic counts, the starting blocks, if you will, for my traffic study were from counts that were collected last fall. We actually did additional counts in the spring. We found that the counts in the fall were actually slightly greater and therefore more conservative, so we used those. Of course, last fall was still during the COVID-19 pandemic, which even to this moment is still an active healthcare concern. So we did some additional investigations to see whether or not we needed to make any additional adjustments to those traffic counts to make sure we had the proper starting point. So now we're going to jump around a little bit, and on the next page, we're going to jump to one of the appendices, Appendix C, which is the traffic counts. Next page. You might just want to use page up and page down, Vern. You could just leave it like that. That's fine. Thank you. So this is just the raw traffic count data. I'm not going to really spend any time on this, but this is the individual turning movements, left, right, and the 15-minute volumes as collected by the traffic count cameras. Next page. These are the peak hourly flows, which we'll get to in another figure later. What I really want to talk about is the next page. This is public information. This comes from the PennDOT Tire website, the PennDOT Traffic Information Repository website. You can just Google PennDOT Tire and you can find this website pretty easily. I looked at all available traffic count data that PennDOT has there because I know that for certain locations, they'll have counts that were conducted at different years. And it's a little hard to make out on the screen, but in the upper right, you'll see a drop pin. That's actually on North Wynwood Road, just south of Montgomery Avenue. So that's relatively near the study area. And what you can see highlighted in blue is that there was a count that was done during the pandemic, namely late October 2020. And the two-way traffic volume on an average daily basis on that road was about 3,700 vehicles at that time. Fortunately, this was also counted exactly 1 year earlier on 2019, which is when the pandemic was not taking place. And that count was somewhat higher, as you might expect. In fact, it was about 12% higher, or the latest count is 12% less, however you want to look at it. Next page. So I see that we're asked to enlarge the study docs. We can do that. It will take a little bit more time, but we'll be happy to do that for Alexandra. So on this page, we're talking now about a different location. You'll see the drop pin is in a slightly different point. This is now on Wynwood Road, basically just east of Penn. Unfortunately, there was not any counts during the pandemic. Interestingly, you can see there was a count in 2019 and 2014. The count in 2019 was substantially less. This probably had something to do with when the traffic signal was installed at the tunnel. That probably had the effect of maybe throttling traffic to some extent, or it could have just been some sort of anomaly. But the important point is there wasn't any count done during 2020. So although I did look at this, it wasn't really useful for making any adjustments. Next page. Thank you. You wanted to zoom in slightly again. Once again, we're on the same road, slightly different location. And once again, there isn't any count done during the pandemic. Although again, interestingly, there was a trend down, as you can see, from 2002, 2007, et cetera. Next slide. Now this one is the most interesting one. This is actually along Route 30. And they actually do have traffic counts that were conducted during the pandemic, as well as several years prior, the most recent before that being 2017. And if you can scroll down slightly, Bern, so we can see the text, thank you. What's interesting about this is the counts during the pandemic were actually higher than they were in 2017 or 2014 or even 2011. Not really sure exactly why that is, but what this data, if you look at it in isolation, suggests is that the counts that we did in September 2020 might not have needed to be adjusted at all to account for COVID conditions, because on a much busier corridor, having a more robust data set, if you will, since there's more traffic volume, it actually shows that traffic activity was not really stymied by the pandemic, and if anything, it was somewhat busier. However, to be conservative, what I did do is I focused on the first slide, which was on Wynwood Road, and decided to increase all of the turning movements at the traffic count by 12%, since that was the best data that I could find from all available counts on PennDOT's website. So now we'll go back to the report, I believe, on the next page. And this is actually, we're jumping around a little bit. This is figure 4. These are the existing peak hour traffic volumes, again, as collected in the fall of 2020. And what this represents simply, as you might be able to determine by just looking at it, are these turning arrows and volumes. So you can see 168, that's how many right turns are made heading in a westbound direction on East Wynwood Road going under the tunnel during the AM peak hours. So over the course of an hour, there's 168 vehicles. So it's about 3 vehicles a minute that make that turn, and somewhat more in the through direction each way on Wynwood during the morning. During the afternoon, the counts aren't really that substantially different. They're slightly higher. So those are the peak hour traffic volumes. Now you might be asking yourself, why are we talking about peak hours? And that's because all the traffic models, or the large majority of traffic models that traffic engineers use, are based on peak hourly flows. They contain formulae and other data sets that are all based against peak hourly flows. So the theory is, if you pick the busiest hours of a typical day, which typically are the commuter peak hours on weekdays, and analyze those, then by extension, any other hour during the day should have less traffic and therefore better performance. So most of what traffic engineers do tend to focus on these peak hours, as you see here on figure 4. Next slide. So now we're jumping back to the text. This is page 3 of the report. Now that we have established what the existing volumes are, the next question is, how much traffic will the site generate? And it's not uncommon for a lay person to say, well, you have one vehicle, you have one house, there's a 2-car garage. That means that there's going to be 2 cars that are active either at all hours of the day or during the peak hours. Interestingly, that's not really what the empirical data that ITE collects shows. The ITE, or Institute of Transportation Engineers, is this international think tank that happens to be headquartered in Washington, D.C. And one of its most important functions is to collect empirical data from traffic engineers and planners, real world count data from existing facilities that the ITE then decides whether or not to include in future editions, future publications of their trip generation manual. So essentially, an individual will go to an existing recently developed office park or retail site and just perform traffic counts at all the driveways and try and relate that traffic activity to some variable, such as thousands of square feet of gross leasable area or number of units if it's residential. And then ITE will consider including that data point and come up with its own equations and rates, as you can see in the 4th column of table 1, that traffic engineers and planners can use to try to hypothesize how much traffic a comparable site will generate in future developments. So what we're talking about here is attached housing. That happens to be ITE Land Use Code 220. And you can see again in table 1 what the formulae are for the average weekday traffic and the AM and PM peak hour traffic volumes. And then table 2 just takes a variable, in this case 6, and plugs it into those equations, and out comes the results. So according to ITE, in a pretty robust database, this site will generate on average about 44 trips over a day. That's total in and out. And during the weekday AM or PM peak, it's only going to be either 3 total trips in the morning or 5 in the afternoon. Now, again, that might sound counterintuitive. If you have 6 units, 2 cars per unit, shouldn't you have 12 trips? And the data simply suggests that people don't all leave en masse during the same 60-minute period. Again, we're talking about 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the afternoon. This does not mean that there won't be trip generation activity in the hours preceding or succeeding each of these peak hours. There will certainly be cars leaving a little bit earlier or a little bit later, for example, during the morning peak hour. But during the busiest times of the day, according to ITE, we're talking about 3 cars an hour. And that's 1 entering and 2 leaving. And then for the PM peak, it's about 3 entering and 2 leaving. Now, as you heard from Mr. Bressy at the outset, the borough has a very capable traffic engineer of its own who will be reviewing this traffic study. And I understand that there might be some out there that think I might have a small problem with bias representing the applicant. But nevertheless, I can assure you that I represent or I utilize the most factual data that I can find for things such as trip generation and traffic counts. And I'm comforted to know that I will be thoroughly reviewed by the borough and the township to make sure that I've done this and other elements correctly, and I believe I have. So with that said, we'll go to the next page. This is just we're jumping around again, I apologize. This is just one of the worksheets that comes right out of the 10th edition of the Trip Generation Manual. And interestingly, you'll see there's a little pictogram of a car in the background. That's brand new for the 10th edition. Previously, ITE really just focused on cars. They just collected traffic count data. But now the world is very different. In the last 10 years, there's been a tremendous push for incorporating multimodalism and pedestrian and bicycle trips, as they rightfully should be, into planning future developments. So now with the current edition, there's actually charts that have a little bicycle in the background and pedestrian in the background. So you can, where available, try and not only predict the trip generation according to ITE for cars, but also for other multimodal aspects. And we'll get to that in a little bit later. Each of these X's represents data points from those real world empirical studies, and then ITE just fits curves to come up with its predictions for people like me to use. Next page. So now we're going back to the text. Page 4 happens to be pedestrian impact. That was a good segue. This pedestrian traffic is an emerging science, and we don't have as much, or ITE doesn't have as much data as it does vehicular data. But what the data does suggest and is published is that the pedestrian trip generation is going to be about on the order of about 10% of the vehicular trips per unit. I think I have a typo there. It says 10 to 11% PED trips. I think it should say vehicular trips. So in any event, that means that this site is going to generate about 1 pedestrian trip per hour, according to ITE. And that's not a whole lot of traffic, pedestrian or otherwise. But what the applicant is offering to do along its rather substantial frontage on Wynwood is not only provide a wider sidewalk, which, as you heard from Mr. Yan, is about 4 feet wide today and increase about 25% to about 5 feet wide, which is in itself not insubstantial, but also provide a verge, which doesn't currently exist. A verge is a grass buffer, which provides a greater separation from cars and people walking on the sidewalk. It makes you feel a little more comfortable. There is no verge at all today. If you walk along, you're walking basically right on the curb. So now we're going to actually have one if this project is developed. I will try to answer questions at the end of the presentation. I just want to stay focused on what I have here, but I'll be happy to answer questions later. So now we get into what happens after the site opens. We talked about existing conditions. We talked about how much traffic the site will generate. So now we want to get into what the real impact of the site is. And that means we need to generate future conditions. And future conditions are usually a function of 3 things: existing traffic, additional traffic due to background growth, as well as other known developments in immediate proximity to a site, and then of course site traffic. And as you heard, there's actually a 4th element, this COVID surcharge, which I explained earlier. This is a typo. It should say 12% surcharge, not 10%. That was applied as well. PennDOT every year puts out its recommendations for what background growth rates should be on a county-wide basis. And it's a broad brush, but it's what traffic engineers, again, typically use. And the most recent data promulgated by PennDOT suggests that Montgomery County is growing at a rate of about 0.25% per year. So that means that that's an amalgamation of not only population increases in general, but also it reflects all development activity in any given county. So to be conservative, I took that suggested starting point and more than doubled it to utilize a background growth rate of 0.5% rather than 0.24%. So in my opinion, that again adds a conservative measure to the study in addition to the pandemic surcharge, and should reflect any specific site developments that might be going on in the near vicinity of the site, but are not reflected individually. Next slide. And if you could zoom back out, Bern, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. So with that all done, what traffic engineers will look at are levels of service. Level of service is a descriptive mechanism that was divined by some traffic engineer decades ago, and it's sort of like a report card grade It gives a letter indication, A, B, C, D, E, and F, as well as a numerical indication. The numerical indication is an estimation by these computer programs of about how long a motorist will wait before being serviced at the intersection. So in the case of the signal, being serviced by the signal. So in other words, if you were a southbound motorist coming out from under the tunnel during the AM peak hour under existing conditions, what the software suggests is that if you went through that intersection an infinite number of times, you would probably wait on average about 28 seconds. And that happens to fall in the range of level of service C, according to the highway capacity manual. So these tables are broken up into black columns and blue columns. Black is the AM peak hour and blue is the PM peak. And then each of those time periods has 3 subcolumns: the existing condition, the future condition without site traffic, and then the future condition with site traffic, no build and build respectively. And one of the things that I do, it's one of my personal touches in my traffic study, is if there's no difference between one scenario and the next scenario, just to try and make it less noisy, I just put 2 dash marks to indicate that there's no change. So as you can see in the first row, there is a 1 second increase that's predicted by the software programs in the AM peak hour due to the background growth. But then the addition of site traffic doesn't result in any additional delay for that particular movement, nor does it for any of the traffic movements or even the overall level of service at the intersection. This again is not Frank Tavani's opinion. This is just what comes out of the computer program when you surcharge the site traffic. These results really shouldn't be surprising, however, because when you're only adding 3 vehicles per hour, 1 vehicle every 20 minutes, you don't really expect to see any substantial impacts on levels of service. And even with the 5 vehicle surcharge during the PM peak, once again, we don't see any substantial surcharge or any even measurable surcharge during the PM peak. We also, of course, looked at the site driveway. There is the inbound driveway and the outbound driveway. And the inbound driveway is sort of the bottom half of this second box. The only movement that technically has delay is the inbound left, because that motorist may occasionally have to wait or yield to oncoming through traffic and can only proceed where when there's a safe gap in order to enter the site. The inbound right is a free flow movement technically, so it has no delay. And once again, we have favorable levels of service, A with 10 seconds. And then the exit driveway, which is right turn only, as I'm sure everyone knows, we're not proposing outbound lefts. That's the top half of this table. And once again, we're at pretty good levels of service. Another element that traffic engineers look at is what the predicted 95th percentile queue lengths are like, to see whether or not they might cause problems, either because they're spilling out of their defined turn bay lengths, if an existing auxiliary turn bay exists, or whether or not they back up to the next intersection. And I won't bore you with these details, but the columns in red are the existing either lengths of existing turn bays or the distance to the next closest upstream intersection. And then the numbers in black and blue are the predicted future no build and build queues. And none of them are really longer than they should be. They all are less than the red numbers. Next slide. So now we're going back again to the text. Another thing that a traffic study could include is something called auxiliary turn lane analysis. PennDOT makes available certain tools that can help guide whether or not a driveway should have a independent left turn lane, an auxiliary left turn lane separate from through traffic, so that people can stack there and wait to enter a driveway, or even a right turn decel lane, since they're not really stacking there. It's just sort of like a slow down lane. And there are Nomographs, these worksheets available, which we'll get to momentarily, and they suggest that neither a left turn or a right turn lane is warranted. So actually, we'll just go to the next page real quick, and then we'll probably come back to this one more. This is, again, Appendix F from the report. These are the Nomographs, if anyone is really curious to see them. You can see it incorporates such things as posted speed limit, advancing and opposing traffic volumes, percentage of trucks, whether or not the terrain is level, rolling, or mountainous. You put in all these variables and it spits out whether or not a left turn lane is warranted. And if it is warranted, how long it should be. And you can see near the bottom, it says that the warrant for this left turn lane is not met. If you go to the next page, which is for the right turn lane, you'll see that that also says no on the right side column. So now, if you don't mind, Bern, we'll go back 3 pages to the text. So We can pick up where we left off. Another thing that we looked at was sight distance. Of course, that's a concern always. There are sight distances made available, recommended sight distances for exiting traffic, leaving a driveway, as well as entering traffic. And DES is the desirable sight distance. SSSD is the safe stopping sight distance, sort of a minimum sight distance. And then the existing available sight distance, as I measured, is in the last column. And in no case do we have any sight distance issues. So that wasn't a problem. And then starting at the bottom of this page, and then we'll skip forward 4 pages. You can just skip ahead now, Bern. I don't want to take up too much more time here. This will be the last page. I did some accident investigations. I have no reason to believe that this site is going to change the accident frequency in the study area. But nevertheless, it's always of some interest to look and see what historic crash frequency is like in a study area. And PennDOT does make this available. PennDOT suggests looking firstly at reportable crashes and then looking at correctable crashes. So reportable means a crash in which either someone was injured enough that they needed medical attention, or at least one vehicle was disabled enough that it could not leave the site on its own power. So, minor contact is not usually considered reportable. Only reportable crashes are reported to PennDOT, which is why they're called reportable. And then there's correctable crashes. PennDOT establishes a threshold that if you have 5 or more reportable crashes in a study area during a 12-month period, a continuous 12-month period, then at that point, you might consider looking into whether or not correctable measures could be made to try and increase or benefit safety in a study area. And that's sort of a term of art, correctable. If you have a drunk driving accident, that's probably not correctable. It has nothing to do with the geometry of the road. That was just a bad decision on the part of the motorist. So you have to use a little bit of judgment and get into the actual crash history to see what's correctable and what isn't. But the first threshold is, do we even get more than 5 per year? And as you can see, I looked over the last available data, 5 years, 2015 to 2019 inclusive. And some years had no reportable crashes, 2 had 1, and 1 had 2. So there was a frequency of less than 1 crash per year on average. So we're nowhere close to the threshold of 5. So it seems like we have no issue with accident history in the study area. And then lastly, very quickly, I did do some parking investigations. ITE also makes available a publication called the Parking Generation Manual, as opposed to Trip Generation Manual. They don't come up with very creative titles for their books at ITE. And the Parking Generation Manual, once again, is just an amalgamation of data points. And if you look at the land use category for the site, ITE says that as many as 2.5 spaces per unit could be the peak parking demand. There were several sites that actually had significantly less than 2.5 spaces per unit as the exhibited parking demand. But knowing that we don't have available parking in front of the site and not wanting to burden the community, we took a belt and suspenders approach of not only cherry picking the highest data point from the Parking Generation Manual, but then going one step further and surcharging an additional 20% to take it to 3 spaces per unit, which is the 18 that you saw on the good Mr. Jan's site plan. So at this point, it's 6:45. I think I've been talking for a while. I don't know if I took too much data. Yes, the traffic accident data does include incidents between cars and bicycles. Slide doesn't address the individual nature of this intersection. Can't see the whole comment. I don't know if we want to ask Deborah to verbalize her comment, but I'll be happy to try and answer it if the borough would like me to.
I wonder if we should wait until we do the question and answers, and that can be part of the questions. Will you be able to stay, or should we handle those now, Frank?
I'm able to stay, but the data might be fresher in people's minds at this point. So it's totally up to you.
I'm happy to repeat the question. I retyped it, but if you can't see it, I'm happy to repeat it.
Go ahead, Deborah.
I just said the study doesn't address the individual nature of the intersection and that the traffic from the complex enters onto a right-hand turn lane or crosses it. And I think that could be problematic.
That's a very good question. Thank you for that. Can we go back a few pages, Bern? Just keep going slowly and I'll tell you when to stop, please. We're going to go back to the trip generation tables specifically. You can stop right there. One more. Forward one. Forward two. So you may remember at the outset that I mentioned that the trip generation for the site is light. During the AM or PM peak hour, the exiting traffic only amounts to 2 vehicles per hour. And again, this reflects all traffic activity. These are empirical observations. They reflect any traffic activity at existing sites. That includes not only resident activity, that includes whatever delivery activity might be taking place, visitor activity, school buses, trash trucks. It's all reflected in the data. And for a site that's only 6 attached housing units, we're looking at 2 exiting trips per hour. And I'll continue talking while I ask Bern to go fast forward to the level of service comparison tables. If you remember.
I'm sorry, how many, currently, how many are exiting there?
There are currently no vehicles exiting the site onto Wynwood.
No, well, I know that. I mean, you know, there are many vehicles taking that right-hand turn, many vehicles.
Yes, it was 168 vehicles per hour during the AM peak, for example, or about 3 per minute. So what I was going to say next is if you look at this table, the top table where it says westbound right, near the bottom, right above the word overall, you'll see an R. That means that the westbound right turning motorists, firstly, often that right turn is free flowing. When you have a green ball indication on Wynwood, that traffic is not stopped, it's not queued up along the site frontage, it's just free flowing. But there are times when it is stopped, obviously. And according to the highway capacity manual software, on average, that right turning motorist may have to wait 15 seconds if they're unfortunate and happen to catch the red light at a certain time. So that queue, if you scroll down a little bit now, Bern, becomes the next question. And that queue is about 155 feet long. It's the very last line on this bottom table in the morning, and about 95 feet long in the afternoon. That's the black 155 and the blue 9395. So that means there will be times, this is the 95th percentile, this is a very high statistical anomaly, but there will be times when the queue of the stopped vehicles will extend to or beyond the exiting site driveway. However, I am comforted to know that there's only 2 vehicles per hour even trying to make that right turn, which isn't much. And if that exiting right turning motorist does happen to, unfortunately, be looking at a queue in front of it so it cannot proceed, namely the queues I just mentioned, they only have to wait on average about 15 seconds before that queue starts moving, and they could probably find an acceptable gap and leave the site.
So what is the two exiting from what? I mean, the complex isn't built yet, so I'm not sure what is 2x, is that a projection that 2 would exit per hour?
That's exactly what it is. You hit it right on the head.
Okay, so 2 cars exiting per hour into a very busy right-hand turn lane, and they may want to go left and they may want to cross that turn lane. I think it's problematic that they have to exit onto a turn lane, and that's just, but I don't know the meaning of that for traffic accidents, but that's the big concern, that of traffic accidents and somebody getting injured or killed.
Yes, we certainly don't want anyone getting injured or killed. And I'll just say it one more time to see if I can assuage your concerns. That right turning motorist is oftentimes free flowing, but when it is stopped, it will have to wait about 15 seconds on average, according to ITE. And that means that if that exiting right turning future motorist leaving the site happens to be unfortunate and there's a queue in front of that motorist so that the exiting motorist cannot proceed, you will only have to wait about 15 seconds or less before you can leave the site. Now, if we were talking about building a Wawa that has hundreds of vehicles and hours going in and out of the site, and we had a right turn delay that was 60 or 80 seconds on average, that would be a problem in my opinion. But here we don't have either of those things. We have a very low predicted delay and we have an extremely low predicted trip generation. So it doesn't really seem like this is going to be a particular fly in the ointment for the site. I don't believe there's any issue with personal safety.
Okay, Frank, thank you for answering that question. I'm thinking that because I said at the beginning that we were going to go through the questions that showed up in the chat in order, so it kind of like how it would be if we were in Borough Hall and folks were standing up at queuing up at a microphone. So I think I'd like to stick with that since I promised that to folks at the beginning.
Very well. Thank you.
So I don't know, Frank, if you have more that if you'd wrapped up, and then I don't know if there's someone else from your team that wanted to speak, or.
I believe Byrne was next, and I
Okay.
am wrapped up at this time.
All
Thank
right.
Frank, you're a wrap?
you. Yes, for now I am. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Bern Panzak. I am principal with Glack and Thomas Panzak. We're landscape architects and land planners in the Paoli area. Thanks for having us. I spent a very enjoyable afternoon biking around the area, and learned quite a bit as a result of that experience. The one we prepared two plan maps, and the first one that you see here is really a consolidation of two studies that were done by the firm Campbell Thomas for Lower Merion Township. And one of them was a pedestrian study, and one of them was a bicycle connectivity study. And what we did is we consolidated those two resources, and that's what you see in front of you. We've got, just to orient you real quick, the site location is right here. Downtown Narberth is in this location. We've got East Wynwood Road, Lancaster Avenue's here. We've got the Wynwood Shopping Center. Whoop, probably that's not a good idea. And this yellow line indicates the borough boundary with Lower Merion. So this being Narberth in here, there's a little piece of Lower Merion here. Points of interest are Narberth train station, Wynwood train station. We got the Whole Foods out near Lancaster. We've got Short Ridge Park in this location, Narberth Park here, the Borough building, and the libraries over here. We've got the North Wynwood Avenue running under the train line. So the tunnel is located adjacent to the site at this location. The teal line is a proposed bicycle route, and I guess I should say that these studies were done back in 2004, and there may be some ongoing studies that we weren't aware of that are updating these things. And Chris Leswing will be able to comment on that. So we've got the teal line, which is a proposed bicycle line, and the purple line is what's called a bicycle priority route. And it seemed to me like the bicycle priority routes were on trails and neighborhood streets that would allow for a safer passage along through the borough here, going on to the Thomas Wynn Apartments and the Maybrook site, working its way through the train station parking lot, and then connecting on up into the neighborhoods. There are pedestrian routes shown in red, which is a proposed route which is on existing sidewalk, and then proposed pedestrian routes to be implemented at the side of the road in pink. Right now, there are currently no sidewalks at those locations. So really what we did, or we were trying to do, was to take some existing resources and to be informed, I guess, really to inform our study as to some of the things and the thinking and the studies that have gone before us. So what I'll do now is I'll go to our analysis, which really is an analysis which looked at sidewalks and the presence of sidewalks, that being these orange lines here. We've got a dotted line which indicates where there are no sidewalks currently. And if you sort of combine this with the previous slide, you begin to understand where that lack of connectivity exists. So, you know, you could see over here in the Narberth area and some of the neighborhoods in Lower Marion, there's a good amount of pedestrian linkage with sidewalks. On the other hand, in the Shortridge neighborhood, that's a different kind of residential community where you do not have sidewalks on the boundaries of the roadways. The other thing we did was we looked at what was termed in the conditions of approval for the tentative sketch plan as gaps, obstacles, and deficiencies. And we identified those gaps, obstacles, and deficiencies with these yellow triangles. And each one of those, you know, has a different classification. There's no sidewalk on the north side of East Wynwood Road. That's indicated with the red dots here. No sidewalks along the Wynwood Shopping Center on the west side of Williams Road. There is a sort of lack of connection. If you go through the Maybrook Apartments, which just put in a very nice and wide bituminous trail system, it does kind of drop off here as you get into going toward the Wynwood Station. Around the Wynwood Station, you've got an elevated sidewalk underneath the train line, which is actually quite nice for pedestrians. It does separate with grade. However, I think what our point there is that it's really not an ADA accessible area. So there are challenges in many areas relative to mobility challenged folks, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. You know, to get underneath the train station or underneath the tracks to connect to the different platforms, you need to go up and down steps. So, you know, those were other things that created barriers and obstacles. You know, and moving sort of back toward the site, the underpass or the tunnel is very narrow. There's a very narrow sidewalk. And, you know, I think both for pedestrians and bicyclists, this underpass is a bit of a challenge and a you know, a bit of a concern because of the proximity of the traffic to that unguarded, very narrow sidewalk. You know, the crosswalk, there is a traffic light at the intersection of North Wynwood Avenue and East Wynwood Road. We believe that there are improvements. We think that the traffic signal timing, which was outlined in Frank's traffic study, is certainly adequate. However, we felt that there were some deficiencies with the pedestrian identity at this crosswalk. It's not a very strong pedestrian visual cue. If you look further up on East Wynwood Road around the commercial districts, there is the ladder crosswalk type of painted crosswalk, which is a much bolder crosswalk. That really wasn't or is not present at this intersection in front of the site. And we think that there's an opportunity there to strengthen that crosswalk cue, that is a pedestrian area and not just some random stop bar for motorists. This is when they are operating in and around that intersection. As Frank did mention, we have proposed a widened sidewalk that is set back from the curb, 5-foot sidewalk with a 2-foot verge. That's this green dotted area. So there would be an improvement there that goes above and beyond what exists now. And everyone, I think, is somewhat familiar with the pedestrian bridge at the end of Elmwood Avenue. Among other things, and in addition to this study, we went and looked at the stream channel with some experts that we brought onto our team. And it was pretty clear that some of the structure that is underneath the current wooden pedestrian bridge at Elmwood is in a failing kind of condition. These are gabion baskets that run underneath and create the channel once it moves from the site and onto the right-of-way of Elmwood Avenue. And this pedestrian bridge is actually, the structure foundation is set on those gabion baskets. So there is some deterioration. We did have a meeting with Narberth Borough officials to review that. And, we think that although it's an important connection, that there are, pretty significant structural issues that have to be solved there, before the bridge can be really improved. That would be really not something that would be advisable to upgrade the bridge without first upgrading a lot of that structural channel work. And we think that that's an important connection, and it will connect pedestrians and continue to connect pedestrians and even future residents of our site to Elmwood Avenue, which we think is a very convenient way to access downtown Narberth and the Narberth train station. There are other challenges, again, really from an ADA standpoint, with crossing through and underneath the train tracks at the Narberth station with the stairs that do exist. There is a bridge further on up the line here. And that bridge is currently closed to vehicular traffic. I'm not quite sure what the issue is. I'm assuming it's a structural issue that's in decline. But again, there are sidewalks and there are some steps that create obstructions to mobility challenged folks at that location. Moving down East Wynwood Road. There are some narrowing of sidewalks. There is some overgrown vegetation that we felt created some obstruction and some challenges with pedestrian movement. And I think if we really think of the big picture, I think challenges of this pedestrian and bicycle environment, it might be the lack of connectivity across East Wynwood Road. And, with the exception of that crosswalk at North Wynwood Avenue, the the pedestrian connections really don't exist until you get into the Wynwood Shopping Center area. So I think the big takeaways here are possible crosswalk placement at Woodside Avenue, which we recognized was a recently improved intersection with depressed curbs and truncated domes, making that a quite a nice improvement at all of those corners. So it was our thought that in terms of connecting neighborhoods to Shortridge Park, that there would be an advantage to identifying crosswalk activity at that intersection. You know, and as I said, the painted ladder paint crosswalk at North Wynwood Avenue would be an improvement. And, you know, there are challenges to this system, you know, to create a better walking and pedestrian environment that, you know, is going to take, as Chris Leswing said earlier, I think, you know, a greater community involvement. So with that, I would just wrap up my discussion about pedestrian and bicycle movement.
Thank you. And if, excuse me, if you could unshare your screen so that we're all back. Wonderful. So before we go through the chat, there was one factual question in there, and maybe Chris Yon, this would be something you could answer, but wondering about, will people be allowed to turn left coming out of the development?
No.
And I'm going to ask the question because I'm sure somebody will say, well, but how will you prevent people from doing that?
So right now we have a series of signs at each driveway showing, you know, one-way arrows, do not enter, stop signs, and then we will work with PennDOT. I know that one of the conditions of approval was to investigate with PennDOT whether or not a physical barrier would be required. To this point, through our discussions with PennDOT, they did not feel that was necessary given the low traffic volume. However, we are still in preliminary talks with them. So when we eventually submit a highway occupancy permit, that will be fully reviewed.
Thank you. So Kimberly, you were the first person in the queue asking to speak tonight. So go ahead.
Thanks. My name's Kimberly Bezak. I'm the founder and the head of Narberth Cycling Club. Bern, I really appreciate your very thorough presentation about the bike and the pedestrian access. And I'm happy to hear that you actually got on a bike and rode around our area. A little bit about Narberth Cycling Club. We were founded in 2017. We really represent bicycling for transportation in Narberth and near. We have at least over 500 members in our club, and we really do focus on making sure that anyone ages 8 to 80, any age, any ability, can hop on a bike and ditch the car and get around our community, whether it's, you know, because they live here, work here, learn here, play, visit, all the above. You know, having an opportunity to look at the documents that were shared, we do have some concerns about bicycle safety. You know, in general, the bicyclists in our community, especially in the mainline suburbs, are still very invisible road users. We are the most vulnerable road users in our community right now. You know, there are sidewalks in this area, but the bicyclists are, you know, out there on two wheels or on trikes, and they're sharing the traffic lanes with faster, heavier, you know, often impatient motor vehicles. So there were a few things that really stood out to us when we were looking at the documents as top areas of concern and opportunities for improvement. And something that was already mentioned was that pedestrian bridge at Elmwood Avenue. We really think it's a missed opportunity right now to upgrade and enhance it to allow one, it to be ADA accessible, and to create a shared use opportunity for those traveling on bike and on foot. You know, I appreciate that this development is, you know, creating opportunities for folks to drive and store their cars, but it would be equally exciting, if not better, to create opportunities for them to ditch the car and really move around our community on foot and on bike, which it's increasingly becoming, you know, that way. One thing with the inbound driveway, we do have some concerns about a left hook scenario, which is often deadly to a bicyclist or a pedestrian. The cars that are traveling eastbound on East Windward Road and are turning left into that driveway, you know, we do have some concerns about slow moving bicycles coming through that area and getting hooked by a car that's trying to jump through a gap in traffic. It just feels like they're being exposed in those two 12-foot driveways. Another thing to point out is that of any area of Windward Road that is currently being utilized by bicyclists, the section from the Narberth Tunnel to Shortridge Park really does see the most use by bicyclists. We are often traveling, you know, from Shortridge Park to Narberth Park area, or we're going beyond that up to Whole Foods. But really that tunnel to Shortridge section does see heavy bicycle use, even though it's not that safe right now. The other thing to highlight is that at Woodside Parkside, I'm happy that you highlighted some potential there, because it is currently part of the proposed mainline greenway, which is a 22-mile corridor that goes all the way from the Kinwood Trail out to Villanova and possibly beyond. So a future trail, on-road trail connection there would be really, really important, and it is currently being visioned and proposed. And I don't want to take up too much time because I know we have a time limit. But yeah, the other thing I just really want to emphasize is that I feel like the plan in a way assumes that bicyclists are going to be moving through this area on the sidewalk. You know, really bikes legally belong in the roadway, and we really advocate for that in our area. We want people to be feeling safe and comfortable choosing to travel around our community on a bicycle. And just if we can pay, you know, maybe give another look to that inbound driveway and that left hook scenario, that's really our top concern. And the intersection at the tunnel, you know, again, being invisible road users, I feel like there are some opportunities there through striping and signage to enhance the experience for bikes moving through that area. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kimberly. So the next person in the queue is Rich, and I know you said you had several questions. Do you think you could ask them all in like a 3-minute period, or keep yourself?
We'll give it a go.
Okay.
And these are for Mr. Tavani about the traffic study. Mr. Tavani, I did read through the study, and it looks like the only data that you reported and recorded was from September 15th, 2020. Is that correct?
There are other counts that were conducted earlier this year, which were not published in the report, but since they were slightly lower and therefore less conservative, they were not utilized, although they were collected and reviewed.
So, and I take it that if I were to set up cameras at that intersection for the same amount of time, I should more or less get the same counts that you got, right?
Well, that would depend on how you define more or less. You know, as an interesting aside, when we were talking about the PennDOT tire web data at the beginning of my direct, I pointed out that even PennDOT's data sometimes has variations that are a little excessive and sometimes hard to explain away without knowing more about what may or may not have been happening when those counts were being conducted. But as a general rule, traffic counts on normal days should vary roughly about 10%, give or take, although
Right.
that's a general rule.
So if when you conducted the traffic count studies were not a typical day, that could be problematic, right?
Yes, yeah, traffic engineers seek to conduct traffic counts on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays if possible, avoiding Mondays and Fridays, since that could include people taking extended vacations or extended weekends. We certainly try to avoid unusual weather events. We try to avoid days where schools might not be in session,
Right.
holidays, things like
Well, the problem is that September 15th, the Lower Merion Public Schools were closed. They were operating virtually. So, and even up until very, very recently, they have been operating mostly virtually. So that certainly could affect the traffic and the way buses can tie up traffic at that intersection. Wouldn't you agree?
I would, and I should disclose at this time that I've been the traffic engineer for the Lower Merion School District for the last 20 years, give or take. And although I don't dispute what you're saying, even when they were teaching virtually, there still is some staff traffic reporting to and from each of the school buildings. And even during virtual sessions, there are certain students that actually are still going to the schools, although not all of the students.
But as we know in Lower Merion.
Can I just finish? Nevertheless, what I did say is that we made adjustments. We added a 12% surcharge based on the best data we could find. And I also mentioned that we collected counts in the spring, and those counts were lower. So I'm not sure if you researched whether the counts in the spring were during a virtual day or not. But the point is, we picked the most conservative data we could find, and then made it even more conservative.
Well, Mr. Tavani, I couldn't research that because it wasn't published in your report, or I would have researched that. But that aside, I am a data-driven person. I don't go on my gut. I can tell you at that intersection that on the occasions when I have had to drive down Wynwood Road to go to my home, where I turn on Woodside Avenue, I have waited much more than a minute at that intersection. And boy, if there's a truck going through the tunnel or a bus, all bets are off, because that really slows the traffic down. And I'm concerned that this development, while you are correct, I'm sure that it's only a couple of vehicles per hour. I hope that this is not the tipping point, because this is during the rush hour, at least my experience has been that this is really a crowded intersection. And the problem with the earlier studies that you also relied on in 2016 and 2017 is that those preceded Maybrook being open, and that has added some significant traffic to that area. So I have some questions. That's all.
Let me see if I can address some of your questions. So firstly, you may have noticed on my letterhead that my address, I work from home, is 248 Beach Hill Road, 19096. That happens to be less than a mile from the site, and I frequently drive on North Wynwood. You mentioned you're data-driven. I'm data-driven as well, but then you went to mention some anecdotal observations, and I can also add them myself as I drive through this intersection practically on a daily basis. Again, if the counts were underreported, all that is really going to do is serve to increase the denominator in a fraction, the site traffic being the numerator. It's only going to further dilute the impact of the site on this intersection. I don't believe there would be any operational concerns at this location. This intersection was tragically difficult about 7 years ago before it was signalized. It's important for everyone to keep in mind that this intersection was recently upgraded with PennDOT safety funds, and that's why it's signalized today. That's why it has auxiliary turn lanes. It has a crosswalk. There was no pedestrian experience previously. So I think the intersection serves very well and is a relatively recent upgrade. And that's something to keep in mind. There's certainly always room for improvement. And as Mr. Leswing pointed out, there probably should be a collaborative effort between the two municipalities going forward to address some of these bigger items. But a 6-unit development probably isn't going to do too much more than what we're talking about tonight.
Okay.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Rich. So the next person in the queue is Emily Stewart. Emily, would you like to ask your questions?
Sorry about that. I was dealing with a 3-year-old, as I do this time of the night.
Understand.
I just wanted to also say very briefly, I'm really grateful for the incorporation of bicycles in this plan, thinking about how bicycles and pedestrians will be able to navigate this area. I myself have a cargo bike. I'm part of the cycling club. And for anyone that does not know what a cargo bike is, it has a big bucket on the back. It's much wider than a normal bike. It's much heavier than a normal bike. I actually put all 3 of my kids in and I ride around to groceries and all over God's good creation. It is my primary form of transportation. So the ability to ride on the sidewalk for me is absolutely impossible. I do need to be in the road. And when I have my children with me, I try to avoid dangerous situations such as going through that tunnel. I would love to see the Elmwood Bridge expanded to include a wider turn that would allow bicycles to go through safely. That would also contribute to ADA accessibility. And just want to echo the appreciation for including bicycles in this, and just knowing that Narberth is such a special community in terms of the people that don't know. There are so many people that truly rely on their bicycles all year round, not just for a nice spring ride, but 12 months out of the year for their primary form of transportation. So I just want to echo that and say how special this community is, and really voice the desire to see some of these changes made in terms of infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Next in the queue were some questions from Judy and Rich Watman. Would you like to speak them yourselves or have someone read them for you?
You can read them for me, but I just have a lot of concerns. I live on Elmwood Avenue, and I'm very concerned about the right turns, turning into the right turn lane. The left turns into the complex, and the Elmwood Avenue Bridge needs to be repaired. And I don't know who does that, but I feel like I'm taking my life in my hands when I walk. I do a lot of walking, so that's my concern.
Okay, thank you. I think you've covered your comments, but that you put in the chat already, with the exception of, you had a question. And I guess this would be for Frank. Have they investigated accident frequency of coming out of the exit and coming across 2 lanes of traffic? Well, but that would mean though that you could make a left turn. Judy, is that what your question was before we knew you couldn't make a left?
Yes, I didn't know that you could you weren't going to be able to make a left-hand turn.
Okay. Super, thank you. And I also noticed a question from someone that I think, Chris, is really for you, and that's a question of, is there going to be bicycle parking at the development? There's lots of car parking, we know that, but is there provisions in there for some bike parking?
We talked about that and decided that we didn't think it'd be necessary to put bike parking on the site. There's 6 units, and 4 of the units have garages on the lower level, 2-car garages, and all 6 have access to that parking area in the rear. So we thought that if a homeowner were riding their bike, that they would pull it into the garage as opposed to leaving it out on the site. In addition, all 6 have front porches. Not that you want to keep your stuff on your front porch, but given the more single family type nature of the homes, it seemed like there was room on a unit or next to a unit to put a bike instead of having a separate area kind of out in the elements.
Okay, thank you, Chris. The next person who wanted to speak is Alex.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I am very concerned about the egress from the development into the right-hand turn lane, and then if you want to go straight, you have to merge into left into the traffic, the next lane left. I think that was expressed by a couple of other people. And I'm also concerned about I don't see any place where the developments that are in the pipeline in Narberth are the cars generated by those developments are taken into consideration in calculating the numbers of additional cars that would be traveling through the tunnel and coming into that intersection. So, or out of the intersection. So there are several developments, and I calculate with the 1.5 cars per unit, 240 cars, new cars, possibly, in the next few years. So I don't see that reflected in the data. I know that you mentioned something, Frank mentioned something about the, there's a percentage that was added on for the total of, development in Lower Merion, I guess, the increase in population or increase in cars. But it seems like the calculation for Narberth would be over 5%. And that's just in Narberth. So, and that's the chances of those cars impacting that corridor is much greater than in Lower Merion in general. So, I mean, we're directly affected by that. So, I mean, we have let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 new developments going on, and some of them are quite large. So I'm concerned about that. I don't think that was taken into consideration, and the use of the word conservative. I think that's kind of a word that has is not used correctly in terms of how people understand conservative. I would say generous estimate if you're really talking about overestimating the amount of cars that would go through there. So I don't think the estimate is generous enough. And I think that needs to be considered. And I also think that the North Wynwood Road, North Wynwood, where it goes, when you're coming down Haverford Avenue and you're turning left to go into the tunnel, there's sometimes a queue that's so long, I'm waiting there 10, 15 minutes. And that's at rush hour, evening rush hour. So those cars are going on to East Wynwood Road. So I don't understand this calculation at all. Anecdotally, it doesn't make sense. And I'm not data driven entirely, because data can be manipulated to fit whatever you want to say. So, okay, that's my comment.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Joe Toscano. And Joe, if you like, I can just read it. Okay. He says this question is for Bernard. Does the pedestrian and bicycling analysis assume cyclists will ride on the sidewalks? If so, how would it be different under the assumption that cyclists are using the road, particularly in terms of safety?
Well, there was no assumption that the cyclists would be using the sidewalks. We did kind of combine both these things, and we realized that they really are two different kind of functions. And that's why we kind of pointed out the studies that were done for Lower Merion regarding the connectivity on roadways. There is a proposed bicycle route for Wynwood Road. Those are much grander undertakings than would be sort of part of our proposal. So creation of a bike lane on East Wynwood Road, I think is a goal, and how that actually gets done. I think there is some desire to put it on the road, you know, and off a sidewalk. So that's what I can tell you. We did not make an assumption that, you know, bicyclists were strictly going to be using sidewalks.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Jean, you have asked to make a comment.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jean Dworak. I live in Narberth. I also bike for transportation, and I help with the Narberth Cycling Club's advocacy efforts to make the area safer for bicyclists. The community is asking or urging the developer to please set aside funds to address the long-term bike and pedestrian safety impacts of the intersection off of Wynwood Road and North Wynwood Road that arise as a result of this development. I think that we need to make sure that bicyclists and pedestrians aren't put at increased risk because of the development. And I just want to echo this safety concerns that Kimberly had brought up, as well as Byrne had brought up in his analysis. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment? We're pretty close to our 90 minutes, a little over our 90 minutes, which is really pretty good. But happy to hear from someone else if there's someone else who has a comment or a question. Okay, well, I'm gonna say thank you all, especially thank you to all of the folks that joined us from their either capacity with the borough or their in their capacity with the developer, and really appreciate you being a part of this town hall. And this will be archived so you can watch it on the YouTube channel, the Narberth Civic Association's YouTube channel, or tell your friends and maybe they'll want to watch it too. So anyway, I wish everyone a good night. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.